This is probably one of the most important people in history that nobody's ever heard of. He shot an archduke, and that started a whole thing. By this point in history, humans have gotten really good at making things deadly. So when the nations of the world mobilized, the result was Armageddon. Then came peace after an armistice was signed. Well, that really got out of hand. Well, good thing it's all over now, so we can figure out who to blame. Great! I made a chart. Dope. Welcome to the Paris Peace Conference. Does anyone have any suggestions on how we keep the peace?
I got 2 words for you. Bureaucracy and revenge.
Dope. Germany receives all the blame, and the humiliation festers for years. But how will we ever prevent this from happening again? Then, this American president makes a good point. 14 points, actually. All nations of the world should stand together, so they can look out for each other and be stronger together. All the countries of the world say yay, and form the League of Nations. But America doesn't join the League. Instead, it chooses isolationism, not wanting to get involved in any of Europe's problems. Also, the League has no military, and some of its bigger members constantly undermine its authority. So if you're trying to create stability and prevent another world war, great start. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but sometimes things don't work out as planned. Today, Japan's biggest export is pure cuteness. So how did they go from Hello Kitty to Hail Hitler? First off, Japanese descended from the samurai, who followed the Bushido code which demanded death before dishonor. Second, Japan had closed shop for about 200 years to keep out Christian influence. This isolation kept Western ideas out, but left Japan in the dust technologically. So when America showed up with big warships and said, hey, you should trade with us, the negotiations were kind of one-sided. To catch up, they powered up with the Meiji Restoration. The samurai class became bureaucrats on steroids. They sent people to different countries to learn the best techniques for setting up a government, building a military, and industrializing. Within less than a generation, Japan went from this to this. Then they do this. But imperialism is for white countries, silly rabbit, so in the event known as the Triple Intervention, this happened. At the time, Japan couldn't do anything about it, but if you've ever seen a karate training montage, you know what happens next. Japan's back with a surprise attack on Russia. Yeah, surprise attack. It's going to be a bit of a theme with Japan. Anyways, they went to war with Russia and won. The rest of the world was like, damn! Because this was the first time an Asian country had ever beaten a European power. This gave Japan mad street cred, allowing them to start expanding. Then, the Great Depression hits, and Japan suffers due to a lack of resources. Conservative elements within the government start pushing the emperor for expansion. The emperor is the top dog and is seen as a god, but he really isn't the guy with his hands on the steering wheel. In fact, it's kind of hard to tell who's driving because the government officials keep getting assassinated and the army just does what it wants. So an event known as the Mukden Incident, Japan blames China for sabotaging a railway, which they may or may not have destroyed themselves. So in self-defense, Japan invades Manchuria and creates a puppet state of Manchu Kuo. The League of Nations is like, okay, you know the drill. Just go back to being a cute little island country again. Japan realizes as much as they act like a Western power, they are never going to be respected like a Western power. So in 1933, they break up with the League of Nations. Meanwhile in China, Japan wasn't even their biggest problem. China had been at civil war for over a decade, until some confusion over a missing Japanese soldier sparked the Marco Polo Bridge incident. Full-on war breaks out between the two countries. This is arguably the first shots of World War II. Japan's war with China is filled with atrocities, including one of the darkest events in modern history, the Nanking Massacre. For 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers loot the city of Nanking, torturing, raping, and murdering 200,000 to 300,000 civilians. Japan finds itself on a dark path looking for friends in all the wrong places. November 1936, they sign an anti-communist pact with Germany and Italy. This is an unlikely alliance that will not be seen again until an Italian plumber from Japan blitzkriegs the video game industry. Speaking of Italy, you never know. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they join forces with the greatest psycho of the 20th century. In World War I, Italy had fought against the Germans, and they were promised this. But at the end of the war, at the Paris Peace Conference, they only got this. This became known as the mutilated victory. The people felt cheated. No bueno. The economy was in freefall. No dinero. Communism was on the rise and the country was on the brink of civil war. Comunito. They were sick of suffering at the hands of a corrupt and inefficient government. Stupito. Italy are the proud descendants of the Roman Empire, once rulers of the Mediterranean. Yet now they couldn't even keep the trains running on time. They needed a leader who could rally the people. Someone who could make properly intense facial expressions. A man like Benito Mussolini. Maestro. Unlike Hitler, who was once an adorable baby, Mussolini was always a jerk. As a child, Mussolini had stabbed another student with a penknife. And just like this senseless act of violence inflicted on that little boy, Mussolini will leave a scar on Italy. He was a walking contradiction, full of machismo, but incredibly insecure. A sociopath, yet he sought the approval of others. And like most insecure sociopaths, he became an elementary school teacher. But it's hard to revolutionize society one young mind at a time. So, he started writing for socialist newspapers and working for trade unions. Initially, he opposed Italy being in the First World War. Previously, he had dodged military service. But he started seeing war as a means for social revolution. These new ideas contradicted socialist beliefs, and for that, he was kicked out of the Socialist Party. But he didn't care. He had founded a new movement, not based on class division, but on national unity. A movement with a strong leader that answered to nobody. The needs of a country would come first, before everything else. This new movement would be called Fascismo, and with it, he would see the return of the Roman Empire. Mussolini was a demagogue, and much like a demogorgon, when he opened his mouth, people paid attention. His convincing speeches quickly developed a cult of personality around him. His supporters were mostly veterans and unemployed men. They wore black shirts and became his unofficial army. In October 1922, Mussolini and 30,000 of his angriest friends marched on Rome and demanded a change in government. The king, being very good at reading a room, was like, how about I make Mussolini the prime minister? As prime minister, Mussolini quickly dismantled the government and muzzled the press. 3 years into his term, he walked into the parliamentary chambers, facepalmed the king and said, I should be in charge. His new title? El Duce. He sorted out the country by putting a stop to strikes and riots. He built roads, bridges, and all kinds of infrastructure. The people loved him at first. These baller moves gained him praise from heads of state, such as Churchill and Roosevelt. Also, a certain German with a funny little mustache was quite impressed with Mussolini's gusto. However, the feeling wasn't mutual. When El Duce first met Hitler, he thought of him as a silly little clown. This silly little clown would soon be pulling levers and chopping cleavers, showing Mussolini how to put the dick in dictatorship. 10 years earlier, when Hitler was a nobody, he watched Mussolini's march on Rome and thought, I can do that. So he organized the Beer Hall Push. However, the push failed and he was sent to jail for high treason. But because he was seen as acting out of patriotic motives, he only received a light sentence. See, a lot of Germans felt that they should have won World War I. This was based on a belief that the government at the time had stabbed the people in the back as part of a Jewish conspiracy. However, the truth is, in 1918, Germany was so drained of resources, it couldn't continue fighting. They straight up lost. However, Hitler used this stab-in-the-back conspiracy to undermine the government and gain sympathy for his cause. Hitler's short time in jail was productive. He wrote a book. He gained credibility as someone willing to sacrifice for the country. But most importantly, he learned 1 + 1 does not equal coup. And at this time, Germany was ripe for a savior, and the Treaty of Versailles continued to be a stain of humiliation. The National Army was reduced to 100,000. The Navy was severely downgraded. Absolutely no Air Force was allowed. They had to give France their industrial Rhineland, which was critical for producing lederhosen. Germany was made to pay massive reparations. So, they printed more money, but that caused mind-boggling inflation, to the point where a loaf of bread cost trillions of marks. The German people were devastated and could do nothing about it. Can you imagine a situation where the government makes you pay back more money than you're capable of earning? Probably, if you have student loans. The more Hitler yelled, the more popular he got, and this dude yelled a lot. The Nazi Party grew in popularity, but not quite enough to get elected into power. So Hitler does what Hitler do. He lied, cheated, and gambled his way into becoming the German Chancellor. He quickly expanded his powers and then purged any opposition. He rebuilt the military and gave him badass toys. He upgraded the Navy, and he created the Luftwaffe. Hitler had everyone's attention. The international community was starting to welcome back Germany. They'd even hosted the Olympics in 1936. But who could have known what Hitler had planned? Except he literally wrote out and published exactly what he intended to do in Mein Kampf. So when he started doing step 1, the next step should not have surprised anybody. Riddle me this. What happens when an arrogant-ass clown meets an egocentric bigot? Hitler was inspired by Mussolini's fascism, and Mussolini was encouraged by Hitler's defiance. In 1935, Mussolini launched an invasion against Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia. The Italians struggled against the poorly equipped Ethiopians. Mussolini had to resort to using illegal chemical weapons to win. Spoiler alert, Mussolini's army rides the struggle bus in every conflict they get into. The Italian apple has fallen far from the Roman tree. The only response from the League of Nations is to add Italy to the naughty list, emboldening Hitler to reoccupy the Rhineland. Now all the pieces are in place. Germany has rebuilt its military and shrugged off the Treaty of Versailles. Italy's economy was still struggling and their armies were unprepared, but they attached their little red wagon to Hitler's rising star for better or worse. The League of Nations might as well be a blind man with a glass hammer. On the other side of the world, Japan has brought full-scale war to China. In Europe, a coalition between Rome and Berlin has been formed. They are determined to be the axis on which the world spins. History will come to know them as the Axis.